Hello, and welcome to our presentation on counseling people of Asian descent. Our group members are Alexis Squires, Ashlyn Stavinoha, Daniel Pyon, Grace Peterson, and Josh Wei. Before we present on the content of the chapter, here's a video that can give some perspective and context to our topic. These are just some of the names, faces, and experiences that illustrate the importance of this work.
The president and vice president said Asian Americans have been unfairly scapegoated during the past year of the pandemic. As senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang reports, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have been the victims of thousands of incidents of violence and harassment.
Mike Wen was stunned to see this at his ramen shop in San Antonio, Texas on Sunday. The words Kung Flu, Kami, and I hope you die covering the windows.
I definitely believe that it's definitely a hate crime.
Wen said the vandalism came after he publicly criticized Texas Governor Greg Abbott's decision to lift a mask mandate.
He's putting a lot of us in danger. He's at a time where we need him to be a leader. He's not being a leader.
A two-time cancer survivor, Wen was worried about his customers' health. Now he's worried about his own.
The next escalation is going to be either physical harm or even something fatal. So, that's very worrisome for me.
So you worry that you could lose your life?
Yeah, absolutely. People have, threatened my life. They say, I hope you die, People say that they want to find where I live and burn down my house.
The advocacy group Stop AAPI Hate has recorded nearly 4,000 crimes against Asian Americans since the start of the pandemic, an increase of about 150% in major U.S. cities. This week alone, a 76-year-old grandmother in San Francisco is recovering after fighting off her attacker. And this 59-year-old man was brutally beaten, nearly blinded in one eye.
Too many Asian Americans have been walking up and down the streets and worrying, waking up each morning the past year feeling their safety and the safety of their loved ones are at stake.
On Friday, President Biden met with Asian American leaders in Atlanta to talk about solutions to combat the violence that just claimed 8 lives in their city, including 6 Asian women. Georgia State Legislature, Michelle Au.
The last administration clearly promoted and fomented a culture of anti-Asian American and anti-immigrant animus. Now, with the Biden administration, he clearly is invested in listening to this issue.
And Thursday on Capitol Hill, lawmakers held a hearing about the surge in attacks.
Asian Americans must not be used as scapegoats in times of crisis. Lives are at stake, and it's critical that Congress takes bold action to address this pandemic of discrimination and hate.
Texas Congressman Chip Roy questioned if a crime should be linked to hate.
Who decides what is hate? Who decides what is the kind of speech that deserves policing?
Roy also defended the use of anti-Chinese rhetoric to describe the virus.
I'm not going to be ashamed of saying I oppose the Chi-Coms.
New York Congresswoman Grace Meng fired back.
This hearing was to address the hurt and pain of our community and to find solutions, and we will not let you take our voice away from us.
Meng introduced the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act after racist voicemails flooded her office.
Chinese virus, Kung Flu, you Kung Flu.
In Los Angeles, Denny Kim heard similar slurs while walking down a sidewalk last month.
They started calling me Chinese virus. They started calling me They started calling me
Kim, a Korean American and a U.S. Air Force veteran, said the assault quickly turned physical.
The assailants, when they were beating me up on the ground, they told me that they wanted to kill me.
Now, both he and Wen are pleading for more protection.
I think what needs to happen is more awareness, and actual charging people with hate crimes, showing that this is not tolerable.
I feel like President Biden really needs to protect Asian Americans right now. If you're listening to me, if you're watching this right now, sir, I need you to help my people, sir, because we're getting shot and killed, sir.
President Biden says he does support Congressman Meng's COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which would require a faster federal response to review and track all of these attacks. Meanwhile, a group of nearly 200 organizations is calling on the White House to provide $300 million to help the victims and to give more resources to combating this violence. Jeff.
Next, Josh Way will tell us about the history of the Asian American experience.
So to begin, we'll start with a brief discussion of Asian American history. And this begins with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first ethnicity-specific immigration ban. This essentially limited and stopped Chinese immigration into the United States and made it very difficult for Chinese immigrants to receive status or citizenship within the country. The Japanese American intern camp of 1942 was the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 enabled immigration based on family reunification, whereas before it was based on national quotas. And this led to a significant increase of Asian immigration in population. And as the Asian American communities and population grew within the United States, the term Asian American identity was also developed. And Asian American communities basically consist of diverse communities of Asian descent from East Asia, such as China or Korea or Japan, to Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam and Cambodia, and to South Asia as well, such as India and Pakistan. And the term Asian American was coined in the 1960s through a shared experience of oppression and discrimination of all Asian ethnicities, that though this community was made up of a diverse set of ethnicities, there is a common struggle of immigration and adjustment to the United States. Asian Americans were viewed and are viewed as the perpetual foreigner, and questions such as, where are you from, continue to reflect this idea. And as Asian American identity and populations grew and developed, so did the model minority myth. And the model minority myth is essentially a stereotype that Asian Americans are successful and have overcome racial obstacles. They are the model minority. This generalizes and overlooks diversity within Asian American identities and experiences. It sets harmful expectations for Asian Americans to prove themselves, as well as the perception that Asian American communities do not need ethnic-specific resources and representation. That as the model minority myth elevates Asian Americans and the myth that they are all doing well, it is also used to discredit oppression and discrimination of other minority groups, which creates tension and competition within and toward Asian American communities.
Now that we know a little bit about Asian American history, let's talk about Asian Americans today. So who exactly are Asian Americans? Asian Americans exhibit much ethnic, linguistic, and historical diversity. According to the textbook, any treatment of this community in strictly aggregate terms obscures the complexities and heterogeneity of the lived experiences of Asian Americans, both currently and historically. In America today, Asian Americans are the fastest growing demographic and make up 5.2% and growing of the population. This contains East Asians, South Asians, and Southeast Asians. Now Grace will explain what it looks like to counsel people of Asian descent.
So as we move into the specifics of counseling Asians and Asian Americans, it is important that first we look at the counselor self-assessment. So before you as the therapist even begin work with those of this population, it's important that you do some work for yourself. So this looks like attending trainings, going to workshops and presentations, gaining more specific knowledge on this population, familiarizing yourself with the literature, and lastly, and most importantly, reflecting on your own biases and assumptions about this population and the impact that those could and most likely will have on your work with these clients. Second is the importance of awareness. So this is the awareness of your ability to bring up these quote unquote taboo issues in a session. So issues of differences between you and your client. This is going to be important for you as the therapist to do, because your client, as your client, is not going to want to bring that up in the session. So it's important that you, as a therapist, are willing to take that first step towards them. 3 questions that you might ask yourself to start that work on that awareness are listed here. Number 1, what might be some personal assumptions and values that will influence your work? 2, how is your identity as the therapist similar or dissimilar from the identity of your client? And 3, what values do you share with your client and what values do you differ on with them? Next is actually going into the counseling process. So there is an importance, and you must realize how counseling, just in general, is broadly viewed in the client's culture. So in this specific culture of Asians and Asian Americans, it's important that we look at, among other things, these 4 aspects right here. So first, your client's view of authority. You are going to be an authority figure in their life. So whether their view of you as authority is positive or negative. Second, the emphasis in this culture on equality and what you as the therapist can do to aid in that process. 2, their willingness, or more likely lack thereof, to discuss emotional issues with you, a stranger. You're going to have to work with them on that. And 4, their expectations for the duration of treatment. Often they are going to expect the treatment to be a lot shorter than it potentially could be. So you're going to have to discuss with them and shift those expectations. And secondly, the idea of building trust is imperative. First, discussing your differences can help build trust, your differences in experience, race, ethnicity, etc., to address and avoid potential for miscommunication with your client. This can build trust with them. And 2, the idea of actually specific self-disclosure, sharing practical, tangible strategies that you have used in your own life as the therapist, can help to build trust with your client as they see you as a human working through your own processes as well. And lastly, conceptualizing the problem. It is first important to align the presenting problem that the client is coming in with their bigger context in their culture. And then as you do that, moving on to assess the significance of that said problem in relation to other factors in their life, whether that's relationships, systems like schoolwork or religion, and the environments that they're in, like their family, etc. And then lastly, to assess the impact of their immigration experience, which is going to be huge for them, whether that is directly they immigrated themselves, in which you need to look at their pre-immigration experience and their post-immigration adjustment, and then to assess the impact of their immigration experience through genetic and generational trauma. If you have a client that did not immigrate directly themselves, whether that was their great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents that immigrated, looking at how that experience for their family, for their ancestors, has impacted them and how they are still experiencing that trauma today, and then working with them through that process in the therapeutic relationship.
Before counseling clients of Asian descent, it's essential to consider the common mental health disorders they may experience. These disorders include racism, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety and schizophrenia, and domestic violence. Due to the racial discrimination Asian Americans encounter, their mental health, physical health, and behaviors are all significantly impacted. The likelihood of mental health disorders has increased, along with suicidal attempts and chronic health conditions. Asian Americans have the tendency to underutilize mental health care, which further increases the likelihood of mental health disorders. Some research shows that Asian Americans have depression at a rate that is equal to or lower than the depressive disorders in the general population. However, recent studies suggested the opposite, indicating that Asian Americans experience depression at a higher rate than the general population. Additionally, it's important to note that older Asian Americans tend to be more at risk for depression. Immigration trauma is the major contributor to PTSD, and the effects from immigration trauma can affect several generations. Furthermore, recent empirical studies show that people of Asian heritage report higher degrees of social anxiety. Lastly, domestic violence is also prevalent, with research suggesting Asian Americans face violence at higher rates than what is nationally documented. There is limited research in this area, but counselors need to be especially aware that their client may be a victim of domestic violence. As previously mentioned, Asian Americans tend to underutilize mental health services. It's crucial for counselors to realize that this generally stems from their worldviews and values. Research also suggests that Asian Americans who do utilize services prefer to use websites, health classes, or health centers opposed to receiving counseling or therapy. Certain barriers that restrict their desire to seek help often stem from an individual's misconception about Western counseling and mental health treatment, as well as certain demographic variables such as a client's gender. Cultural values will also impact how a client views their mental illness. Since body and mind are viewed as inseparable, and holistic healing is of high importance, more frequently alternative methods of healing are pursued. Now I will discuss the various sites that allow Asian Americans to effectively cope. These sites include alternative healing services, activities such as yoga or acupuncture, churches, and temples. Asian Americans may also engage in astrology or utilize palm reading. The largest mode of support is the individual's family and social community. Research shows that the family dynamic can also provide psychological support for the individual. Counselors should take into consideration the collectivistic culture and how this affects the overall method of treatment and treatment recommendations.
Here are some general principles to keep in mind when working with Asian clients. Because of the cultural value of privacy, Asian American clients may not openly express strong emotions or disclose personal and family values. One pair of researchers found that Asian Americans typically prefer an authoritarian, directive, and structured approach to treatment. Some others found that Asian Americans typically do better when matched with counselors with similar ethnicity or gender. It is important to remember, however, that Asians and Asian Americans are not a monolith. While these guidelines are important, it is also important not to stereotype your clients based on your past relationships or experiences with Asian Americans. The experience of your client should be the primary driver of your counseling with them. For example, even members of the same ethnic group or nationality might have very different acculturation levels, or view their immigration experience as positive or negative, depending on the circumstances. Therefore, it is important to develop a range of treatment modalities when working with members of this community, and not simply apply a one-size-fits-all approach. One way clinicians can conceptualize their client's experience is to assess the level of the problem, whether individual, relational, or environmental. Like many other minority groups, Asian Americans are still underrepresented amongst those who participate in psychotherapy. Therefore, it is important to remember that counselors who plan to work with members of this group may need to participate in outreach activities. When doing so, remember that Asian Americans tend to rely on word-of-mouth referrals rather than other forms of advertisement. Especially important is the appearance of expertness of the counselor and the feeling of trustworthiness that is established. Essentially, this means that counselors who work with this group must be competent and authentic. Finally, counselors who work with members of this group can increase their trustworthiness by engaging with the struggles of Asian Americans. Here are some themes for how to engage ethically on behalf of Asian American clients. Learn by engagement rather than through a textbook. Get to actually know some Asian Americans as friends, colleagues, or church members to get a sense of their unique experience. Also, engage responsibly by connecting clients to resources and do all you can to minimize your own bias and discriminatory beliefs or attitudes. Finally, among these other things, ask yourself what you can do on behalf of the Asian American community. There are many local and national groups who you can collaborate with to engage in this work. This concludes our presentation on counseling people of Asian descent. We hope you learned something useful and feel empowered to serve members of this community. Thank you.